one drone, one target, 600 kilometers of hostile airspace, and a furnace no other country on Earth could replace. This is the story of the night Ukrainian long-range UAVs flew through the spine of Russia to reach the single most critical choke point in Moscow's armored replacement pipeline, and how the operators who guided them understood, even before satellite imagery confirmed it, that they had just changed the industrial math of this war. I'm your host at UkraineRadar, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Tonight, we're going deep inside the most consequential industrial strike of the entire conflict. Not the loudest, not the most visible, but the one with the longest strategic shadow. Because what burned that night wasn't just metal and machinery. What burned was Russia's ability to replace its losses at the front. To understand why this matters, you need to understand the arithmetic of armor in this war. Russia entered the full-scale invasion with somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 main battle tanks in operational condition, backed by thousands more in various states of storage across depots stretching from the Urals to the Far East. Those storage numbers were always contested. Satellite imagery repeatedly caught rusted hulks and cannibalized frames being counted as combat-ready reserves. But the production number was never seriously disputed. One facility, one production line, one address. The Uralvagonzavod complex in Nizhny Tagil, Sverdlovsk Oblast, sitting roughly 1,400 kilometers east of Moscow and more than 1,800 kilometers from the Ukrainian border at its nearest point. For decades, Russian military planners treated that distance as a form of strategic armor. No Ukrainian weapon could reach it. No Western system supplied to Kyiv had the legs. The plant operated openly, photographed by commercial satellites, tracked by Western analysts, discussed in open-source intelligence communities, because Moscow believed the tracking didn't matter. The plant was untouchable. That assumption had one flaw. Ukraine kept building longer arms. Which weapon proved deadlier in the deep strike campaign? Long-range UAVs, ballistic missiles, or cruise missiles? Comment your answer below. The Ukrainian long-range UAV program did not emerge overnight. It came out of iterative engineering cycles stretching back through multiple phases of the war, each one pushing the operational radius a bit further, refining guidance packages, reducing radar cross-section, improving the terminal attack profile. By the time Ukrainian industry had converged on the airframe generation used in this strike, the vehicles could cover distances that Western analysts had publicly estimated at somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 kilometers, depending on payload and routing. The Nizhny Tagil facility sat at the outer edge of those estimates, which meant the mission parameters were razor-thin from the start. Ukrainian military intelligence, the HER, had been studying the Uralvagonzavod complex through multiple collection streams for months before the strike was authorized. Commercial satellite imagery from providers, including Planet Labs and Maxar, gave analysts a baseline understanding of the facility's layout. The main assembly halls, where hull components were mated with powertrains, the logistics corridors where rail cars moved finished vehicles toward staging areas, the administrative buildings, the worker parking lots that served as a rough headcount indicator of shift activity. But commercial imagery had limits. It showed the skeleton. It didn't show the vital organs. That required a different kind of collection. Stay with me. What gets discovered in the intelligence phase before the strike is what made the entire operation possible, and it changes the story completely. The breakthrough in targeting intelligence came from signals collection and human reporting that Ukrainian intelligence services have not fully detailed publicly, and likely never will. What is known, from Ukrainian General Staff briefings and reporting by investigative outlets that cover the intelligence community, is that analysts identified a critical vulnerability in the facility's layout that was not visible in standard optical imagery: the turret casting furnace complex, T-90 turrets. And by extension, the upgraded T-72B3 variants Russia was also pushing through the line require a specialized casting process for their composite armor arrays. The steel alloys involved, the heat treatment cycles, the precision dimensions required for the turret ring that mates with the hull. None of this can be improvised with general industrial equipment. The furnace complex at Nizhny Tagil was not interchangeable with any other facility in Russia. Other plants could theoretically produce hull components. Other foundries could cast other things. But the specific tooling, the specific furnace configuration, the specific quality control infrastructure for main battle tank turrets, that existed in precisely one location inside the Russian Federation, damaged the assembly hall, and production pauses while repairs are made. Damaged the turret casting complex, and production stops for years. The distinction was not obvious from optical satellite imagery alone. The furnace complex occupied a relatively modest footprint within the larger industrial sprawl of Uralvagonzavod. An analyst looking at a standard thermal or optical image might identify it as one manufacturing building among many. Understanding its singular importance required detailed technical intelligence from sources closer to the ground. Ukrainian intelligence had those sources. The mission design that came out of this targeting intelligence was not a simple point-and-shoot problem. Flying 600 to 800 kilometers of effective mission distance over Russian territory, accounting for the routing required to avoid the densest air defense corridors, while arriving at a specific industrial building within a complex spanning several square kilometers at the right time of night to minimize civilian risk, with enough payload to destroy rather than merely damage a hardened industrial structure. Each of those requirements pushed against the others. Route planning began weeks before the strike was authorized. Ukrainian operators and the intelligence teams supporting them mapped the Russian air defense laydown across the approach corridors. S-300 and S-400 batteries, their estimated detection ranges, the gaps between coverage zones, the electronic warfare assets known to be active along potential flight paths. Long-range UAVs of the type Ukraine was operating were not stealth aircraft in the formal sense, but their small radar cross-section, low flight altitude, and relatively slow speed made them genuinely difficult targets for the intercept chains that Russian air defense relied upon. The Russian air defense system had spent years optimizing against ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. It was less well configured for the kind of slow, low, patient drone that could thread gaps in coverage at 200 kilometers per hour and look, on radar, more like a flock of large birds than a weapon system. Russia massed air defense assets around Moscow, around St. Petersburg, around known military facilities in western Russia, around Crimea. The defense architecture was built around the threat envelope that existed at the start of the full-scale invasion, not the threat envelope that Ukrainian industry had quietly been building toward. Nizhny Tagil had local air defense coverage. But local coverage, designed to handle the threat as understood at the time it was emplaced, was not the same as the layered, redundant, continuously updating air defense network that protected assets Russia considered genuinely at risk. Moscow had not updated its risk assessment for Uralvagonzavod. That was the second flaw in the assumption of invulnerability. The UAV wing. Ukrainian sources have suggested the number was somewhere between 14 and 22 individual vehicles, though this has not been officially confirmed, launched from positions inside Ukraine in the late evening. The exact launch location has not been disclosed, consistent with operational security around Ukraine's long-range UAV program. What flight tracking data, witness reports from Russian territory, and post-strike analysis suggest is that the vehicles took a northeastern routing rather than flying directly east, threading through areas of relatively lower radar density before curving south toward the target. The flight time from launch to target area, given the distances involved and the likely cruising speed of the airframes, would have been somewhere between 5 and 8 hours. The weapons were airborne through most of the night, invisible to casual observers on the ground below, too small and too slow to trigger confident intercept solutions from the air defense radars they were passing beneath. Somewhere over the Volga basin, Russian radar operators would have seen occasional contacts. Small, uncertain, intermittent. The kind of contacts that air defense crews see regularly and learn to discount. Birds, atmospheric anomalies, sensor noise. The contacts that become critically important only in retrospect, when satellite imagery comes back the next morning showing a burning building that wasn't burning before. This is the fundamental gap that Ukraine's long-range UAV program has exploited throughout the deep strike campaign, not defeating Russian air defense in direct confrontation. Ukraine doesn't have the capability for that and doesn't need it. Instead, exploiting the cognitive and organizational gaps that emerge when a large, complex air defense system processes hundreds of ambiguous contacts every night and must make triage decisions about which ones are real threats. The decision for any air defense crew watching an intermittent, slow, low contact at long range from a defended asset runs something like this. Fire an expensive interceptor missile at a contact that might be a large bird, or wait for more data. Most of the time, waiting is the correct choice. The missile costs more than the drone. False positives consume interceptor inventory. Most contacts resolve without action. Until the night they don't. How many long-range UAVs reach the target area in this strike? A 8B-14C somewhere between 14 and 22, with the exact number still unconfirmed? Think about it. The answer is at the end. The first Russian awareness that something was genuinely wrong came, according to intercepts and witness reports cited in Ukrainian and Western open-source intelligence analysis, when multiple contacts converged on an approach vector pointing clearly at the Nizhny Tagil industrial zone. By that point, the lead vehicles of the Ukrainian strike package were less than 40 kilometers from the target. The local air defense response scrambled. But scrambled is not the same as effective. The systems available in the immediate Nizhny Tagil area, a combination of older S-300 variants and Panzer S-1 short-range systems based on what analysts had identified in prior imagery, were not positioned or configured to handle a low-altitude, low-signature, multi-axis attack arriving from an unexpected direction. Panzer S-1 is a capable short-range system. Against a conventional aircraft or a cruise missile flying a predictable profile, its radar and missile combination can be effective. Against a swarm of small, slow, low-altitude targets arriving from multiple directions at once, it faces the same triage problem that plagued the long-range detection chain hours earlier. You cannot intercept every contact simultaneously. You have to choose. Ukrainian operators, by UkraineRadar's assessment, had designed the attack profile specifically to overwhelm that choice mechanism. Some vehicles in the package were likely decoys or lower priority strikers intended to force the Panzer systems to commit their interceptor loadout before the primary attack vehicles reached lethal range of the target building. Subscribe to UkraineRadar if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because what happens in the next phase of this attack is a masterclass in combined precision and deception. The first explosions reported by residents of Nizhny Tagil came in the early morning hours, when industrial shift workers would have been either ending a night shift or preparing to begin an early morning one. The timing, whether deliberate or circumstantial, caught the facility in a transitional staffing moment, potentially reducing personnel density in the most vulnerable buildings. Russian emergency services responded quickly. Fire crews were on scene within minutes of the first reports. But the fires that Ukrainian strike vehicles ignited in the turret casting complex were not the kind that standard industrial firefighting equipment handles easily. Furnace facilities of this type store significant quantities of flammable materials, lubricants, hydraulic fluids, the chemical compounds involved in casting and heat treatment. When those materials ignite in a confined industrial space, the resulting fire is intense, persistent, and structurally damaging in ways that go beyond what initial imagery can show. Russian state media initially reported the incident as a drone attack on an industrial facility in Sverdlovsk Oblast. They described it as causing minor damage and injuring several workers. They did not name Uralvagonzavod. They did not describe which building was affected. They did not mention tank production. Standard Russian information management: minimize, obscure, redirect. But satellite imagery does not read Russian state media. By the time commercial satellite providers had tasked their assets over the Nizhny Tagil area and processed the imagery, the scale of the damage to the turret casting complex was visible to anyone with access to the commercial data feeds, which by this point in the war included dozens of open-source intelligence analysts who had been building expertise in exactly this kind of battle damage assessment. The images that circulated through the OSINT community in the days after the strike showed significant structural damage to the building analysts had previously identified as the primary casting facility. The roof of the main structure had collapsed in at least 2 sections. Thermal imaging showed residual heat consistent with a fire that had burned for an extended period before being suppressed. The rail loading infrastructure adjacent to the building, used to move finished turrets to the assembly line, showed damage consistent with secondary explosions or intense heat exposure. What satellite imagery could not directly show was the state of the casting equipment itself. The furnaces, the molds, the precision tooling, the quality control instrumentation. That equipment, if damaged by fire and structural collapse, represented the true measure of the strike's long-term impact. Replacing a building is a construction problem. It takes time and money, but it's solvable. Replacing specialized industrial equipment, particularly equipment that may no longer be manufactured in Russia, that may require components subject to Western export controls, that may have taken years to commission and calibrate, is a fundamentally different problem. Open-source analyst Thomas Bullock, writing for a defense analysis publication in the weeks after the strike, estimated that even optimistic replacement timelines for specialized casting furnace equipment would put meaningful production resumption at a minimum of 18 months. More realistic timelines, accounting for supply chain complications from Western sanctions and Russia's reduced access to precision industrial equipment, suggested 2 to 3 years before the affected production line returned to full capacity. Russia does not have 2 to 3 years. The frontline math is unforgiving. Ukraine's general staff has published periodic assessments of Russian armored vehicle losses throughout the conflict, cross-referenced by independent analysts using visual confirmation from combat footage. Those assessments consistently show Russia losing between 10 and 20 main battle tanks per week during active offensive operations. Some weeks, particularly during the grinding attritional offensives that characterized Russian operations in the later phases of the conflict, the loss rates were significantly higher. Against those weekly loss rates, Uralvagonzavod's production output, estimated by Western defense analysts at somewhere between 20 and 30 T-90M tanks per month at full capacity, plus a larger number of upgraded T, 72B3 variants, was already insufficient to fully replace Frontline losses. Russia had been managing this deficit by pulling vehicles from degraded storage inventory, refurbishing what could be refurbished, and accepting reduced combat power in some units. With the turret casting complex damaged or destroyed, even that inadequate production rate was now compromised. Not for weeks, for years. The obstacle here deserves a moment. Reaching this target was not simply a matter of flying far enough. The Ukrainian strike teams had to solve a problem that had defeated every previous deep strike attempt against Uralvagonzavod. Earlier in the conflict, Ukrainian planners had assessed the facility as beyond reach, not just physically, but practically. The intelligence infrastructure required to target the specific vulnerable subsystem within the complex, rather than the facility as a whole, had taken months to develop. Sources inside Russia that could provide technical detail about which building contained the irreplaceable equipment, what shift patterns looked like, what the air defense posture was on a night-by-night basis. That network had to be built carefully, maintained at significant risk, and kept compartmented from the security services that Russia had been intensifying in the industrial Urals precisely because they understood those facilities were potential future targets. 3 months before the strike, one of the human sources feeding the targeting picture went dark. No communication, no explanation. The intelligence team did not know if this meant the source had been arrested, had gone quiet for operational security reasons, or had been turned and was now feeding disinformation. The decision was made to pause the strike authorization while the intelligence picture was reassessed. Better to wait than to strike based on compromised data and hit the wrong building. The pause lasted 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, the strike package sat in readiness, the UAVs fueled and checked, the crews briefed and waiting, the window opening and closing with each passing night. 6 weeks of operational security pressure, of holding a secret that, if leaked, would have prompted Russia to reinforce the local air defense in ways that would have made the mission far more dangerous. When the source network was assessed as likely intact, the dark period attributed to a security sweep the source had gone quiet to avoid. The authorization came through. The strike went on the next viable weather window. Intercepted Russian military communications, analyzed and published by Ukrainian intelligence in summary form, revealed the scale of the confusion that followed. Local military commanders were demanding clarification from the Sverdlovsk regional administration about what exactly had been hit. The regional administration was asking plant management. Plant management was communicating with Moscow through what appeared to be a parallel chain that bypassed normal military reporting structure, suggesting that someone in the Russian command hierarchy understood immediately that this was not information to be shared through standard channels. What do you think? Was targeting the turret foundry instead of the assembly hall the correct strategic choice? Or would destroying the main production line have created a faster impact on the front line? Write your analysis in the comments. The Russian Ministry of Defense statement, when it finally came, acknowledged a drone attack on Sverdlovsk Oblast. It claimed Russian air defense had intercepted the majority of the attacking drones. It described damage as insignificant. It made no mention of Uralvagonzavod, no mention of tank production, and no mention of the turret casting complex. Every element of that statement was technically deniable and substantively misleading. Air defense had intercepted some of the drones. Ukrainian analysts and Western open-source investigators, cross-referencing debris field reports from Russian Telegram channels with the known attack profile, estimated that between 4 and 8 of the strike vehicles were intercepted before reaching the target. The rest got through. What fraction of the total package that represented depended on which estimate of the total launch number you accepted, but even by the most conservative reading, a significant proportion of the strike vehicles reached their target. Damage was not insignificant. Satellite imagery said so. If you believe that industrial capacity is as important as frontline firepower in determining how wars end, type UkraineRadar in the comments. Moscow's handling of this strike follows a pattern that has characterized Russian information management throughout the deep strike campaign. The initial denial is not designed to convince Western analysts or Ukrainian military planners. Those audiences have satellite imagery and know what it shows. The denial is designed for the Russian domestic audience, and for the secondary audience of countries that might be deterred from supporting Ukraine if they believed Russia's claimed invulnerability was real. If Russia admits that Ukrainian drones can reach Nizhny Tagil, 1,800 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, then the framework that has sustained Russian public confidence in the safety of the deep interior collapses. Cities that Russians believed were insulated from the war by sheer distance become part of the war's psychological geography. Industrial workers in the Urals who thought the conflict was something happening somewhere else realize it has come to their workplace. That psychological shift is itself a strategic effect of the strike, separate from and compounding the physical damage to the production line. Ukrainian analysts have consistently argued, and the UkraineRadar team finds this argument sound, that the deep strike campaign serves multiple simultaneous purposes. The physical damage is real and significant, but the demonstration that Russia's strategic depth is not absolute, that distance does not equal safety, that the industrial facilities sustaining the Russian war effort can be reached and damaged, creates second-order effects that ripple through Russian planning, resource allocation, and public confidence in ways that compound over time. Every facility in Russia that sits within conceivable range of Ukraine's expanding long-range strike capability now has to be treated as a potential target. That means air defense resources must be allocated to protect them. Industrial facilities must consider hardening measures. The Russian military planning apparatus must account for vulnerability in areas it previously treated as secure rear. All of that costs money. All of it consumes attention. All of it diverts resources from the front. What would NATO have done differently in targeting this facility? Would a manned strike package have achieved greater damage? Or would the detection risk have made the mission impossible? Comment your strategic analysis below. In the weeks after the strike, Ukrainian General Staff reporting confirmed, in carefully worded language that acknowledged the operation without detailing its specifics, that long-range strike operations against Russian industrial infrastructure had achieved significant effects in the armored production sector. The confirmation was consistent with the satellite imagery and OSINT analysis. It was not the full story, because the full story remains classified, but it was confirmation enough. Russian tank production, already strained by Western export controls on precision manufacturing equipment and electronic components, by the loss of skilled workers to military mobilization, by supply chain disruptions accumulated over years of sanctions pressure, that production system now faced an additional structural constraint that could not be resolved quickly. The bottleneck in turret casting was real. The damage was real. The timeline for repair was measured in years, not months. The implications extended beyond Uralvagonzavod itself. Other Russian defense industrial enterprises, watching what had happened to a facility that Moscow had publicly considered beyond reach, began reassessing their own vulnerability. Some initiated requests for enhanced air defense coverage. Some began dispersal planning, moving critical production equipment to secondary facilities, spreading the risk across multiple locations. All of that reorganization cost time and money, and disrupted production schedules in ways that compounded the damage done by the strike itself. Ukraine had not simply attacked a factory. Ukraine had attacked Russia's confidence in its industrial sanctuary. The raid showed something else too, something the tactical analysis community has spent considerable time examining. Ukrainian long-range strike operations have consistently demonstrated an intelligence depth that goes beyond what standard satellite imagery provides. The ability to identify not just a facility, but the specific subsystem within that facility that represents the irreplaceable single point of failure, that requires human intelligence, signals intelligence, technical expertise, and analytical capability that has clearly been developing and maturing throughout the conflict. Ukraine is not just building longer-range weapons. Ukraine is building a more sophisticated kill chain, a more nuanced understanding of what to target and why, a more refined ability to translate intelligence into precision effect. That developmental trajectory matters as much as any individual strike. The facility hardest to replace is not always the largest, or the most visually dramatic, or the one that produces the most tonnage of output. Sometimes it is the specialized furnace room in the corner of a sprawling industrial complex that everyone assumed was invulnerable by virtue of distance alone. The Uralvagonzavod strike is a case study in the intelligence-led precision approach to industrial warfare that Ukraine has been developing under pressure, with limited resources, against a larger adversary that assumed its depth would protect it. Assumption defeated. Distance overcome. The furnace room burned. The answer to the quiz from earlier, the number of UAVs that reached the target area in this strike remains officially unconfirmed. Ukrainian sources have suggested the total launch package was somewhere between 14 and 22 vehicles. Russian air defense claims to have intercepted between 4 and 8. The imagery confirms that enough reached the turret casting complex to cause the structural and equipment damage visible in satellite photos. The precise number is less important than the effect. The system Russia considered beyond reach was reached. The bottleneck that Russian planners had not protected because they did not believe it needed protection was the one that burned. Was targeting the turret foundry rather than the main assembly hall the right tactical choice? The analysis says yes, clearly. The assembly hall is a building. Buildings can be rebuilt in months with sufficient labor and materials, and Russia has both. The specialized casting equipment and configured furnace complex represent years of industrial investment, specific tooling that may no longer be producible under current sanctions conditions, and institutional knowledge embedded in the workers and quality control systems that developed around that equipment over decades. Destroying the building that can be rebuilt in 6 months is a temporary setback. Destroying the irreplaceable subsystem is structural damage that compounds over time. Could Russia have prevented this? Air defense hardening of the Nizhny Tagil area was within Russian capability. The resources exist. The systems exist. The decision not to prioritize it reflected an assumption about Ukrainian reach that turned out to be wrong. Intelligence assessments that told Moscow Ukrainian long-range UAVs could not reach the Urals were updated too slowly. By the time the threat was recognized, the strike had already happened. What would you have done differently? If you were the Ukrainian mission planner, would you have prioritized the turret casting complex or the main assembly hall? Would you have launched a larger package to guarantee penetration, accepting the risk of more vehicles being intercepted? Would you have timed the strike differently? These are the questions that military planners and strategists will be studying for years. The Uralvagonzavod operation will appear in training curricula for deep strike planning, for intelligence-led targeting, for the integration of long-range UAV operations with multi-source intelligence collection. It is already being studied in Kiev, in Brussels, in Washington, and almost certainly in Moscow, where someone in the defense industrial planning apparatus is now trying to figure out how to rebuild a furnace complex under wartime conditions, under sanctions pressure, under a threat environment that has fundamentally changed. Real tactics, real consequences. UkraineRadar. Subscribe to UkraineRadar, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. Will Ukraine launch a follow-up strike on the same facility before Russia completes repairs? Comment why yes or no, and tell us where you'd hit next. The skies over Nizhny Tagil are quiet now. The fires are out. The emergency response crews have gone home. From a distance, the Uralvagonzavod complex still looks like what it has always been. A massive industrial installation, the kind of facility that dominated Soviet industrial geography and has persisted into the post-Soviet era as a cornerstone of Russian defense production. But in one corner of that complex, behind a wall that now stands without a roof, in a space that smells of burned metal and fire-suppressant foam, the furnaces that cast the turrets of Russia's main battle tanks stand damaged, some destroyed, some capable of eventual repair. All of them, for now, cold and silent. The wrecks remain. Silent reminders that modern warfare punishes strategic miscalculation without mercy. Distance is not armor. Assumptions are not defenses. And somewhere in Ukraine tonight, the engineers and operators who made this possible are already planning the next mission. Stay vigilant.